Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 373. I'm the host, Kyle Lanslone. A lot of news to get to on today's show, but first I want to mention antiwar.com is hosting their winter fundraiser. I'm the opinion editor there, and every day we're putting out a lot of content that takes on the propaganda put out by the American empire. They want to spend more of our money on wars. They want to kill more, and we want to stop it. And so if you want to help us, head on over to antiwar.com and make a donation. The show is also hosted with the Libertarian Institute, so if you can't donate, just share the show if you can. We really appreciate it. And with that, I will get into the news today. I want to start off with something a little bit different, but I think it's really important. So one of the things that the establishment really does to try to justify our interventions, say Iran or China, now Venezuela, Cuba, is we say these governments are bad to their own people. And if you look at it, it's pretty true. Now, some of the more egregious claims are usually overstated, but does Iran execute protesters? Absolutely. I'm sure that happens in Venezuela. Does Cuba round up people who protest against the government? Absolutely. Are there people in China who are thrown in prison for their political beliefs? I'm absolutely sure that's the case. Maybe the whole Uyghur genocide narrative is quite overblown, but again, that doesn't mean that the Beijing government is good to the Uyghur people overall. There's just a difference between not being good to a group of people and a full-on genocide. So one of the ways I think we had this idea that America is just so perfect that it can go around the world and doing these things, that we're so much better than Iran and China or Iraq under Saddam or Syria under Assad, that to go around and regime change these countries, we could do that because we understand morality and we understand how things work. And there's a story here that really proves that isn't the case, and this is in Newsweek. Starved to death in an American jail, the man who couldn't pay a $100 bill. Or bail, I think. And routinely homeless schizophrenic with an IQ below 55, Larry Eugene Price Jr. wandered into the small Northwest Arkansas police station on August 19, 2020, as he did nearly every day. Police in the town of Fort Smith were used to seeing Price, then 50, coming in, hanging around for a bit, then leaving. But on that day in late summer, Price, also diagnosed with bipolar and having PTSD, used his finger like a gun to point around the police station at officers, threatening and cursing at those present. Officers, seemingly concerned for his well-being and those in the station, arrested him on a state felony, and that felony was terroristic threatening in the first degree. Standing 6'2" and nearly 200 pounds, Price, according to police reports, wasn't an immediate threat. He had no real weapon, but there was no settling him down or reasoning with him, which you should really expect to happen with somebody who has an IQ below 55, has schizophrenia, bipolar, and PTSD. If that person is at all worked up, they wouldn't be able to be settled down by reasoning them. That's just not going to work. There's other de-escalation methods that can help people in that state. I worked in this field for a little bit, so I'm very familiar with people who have lower IQs, who have schizophrenia and bipolar. And typically with being a homeless person at the age of 50, you've probably experienced some kind of trauma that caused you to have PTSD. It's a really tough life. And so, it's to be expected that I think that, as somewhere along the line, you will put yourself in a position or something would have happened to you being homeless that would have been fairly traumatic. So, very hard. After he was locked up, he went before a judge who sent his bond at $1,000. It would be simple. He would be free if he paid $1,000 bail. But he was destitute and didn't have any money. Again, this is very common for somebody who is in his situation, where it's pretty hard to, not necessarily for somebody who is of average intelligence or something. I'm not saying that, but for somebody with schizophrenia, where it's very hard to keep track of your paperwork, your IDs and things like that, especially anytime you're having any kind of serious schizophrenic symptoms, you lose a lot of paperwork and things like that. It's very hard to hold on to. And so to maintain any kind of bank account income or welfare, anything is very, very difficult. difficult. So, it's not surprising to me that he wasn't able to pay that. And again, it's pretty clear from, everything in the story so far that this man didn't belong in jail. He didn't deserve to have his bail set. He was having a mental health episode and should have been directed towards mental health services. From then, everything else that could have gone wrong for Price did. His mind lost, his health gone, and seemingly no one paying attention to his well-being. Price was dead a year later at 51. And imagine saying that, and seemingly no one paying attention to his well-being as he is in the complete custody of the state. He was in a solitary confinement cell, so there is like nobody else in the country, unless you're in a position as him, who has your life controlled as much by the state as Price did. And yet, he died in a year, and we'll get into why here. He was found in a solitary confinement cell with his eyes wide open, naked, starved, dried saliva on the corners of his mouth, in a pool of standing water so large his feet had shriveled. He had long since his medication taken away. Towards the end, he had resorted to eating his own feces and drinking his own urine. By the time emergency services arrived at the jail, Price, normally a solid man, weighed just 90 pounds. Imagine that. 6'2", he weighed 90 pounds, EMS records show. Yet, even after his death, monitors in the jail continued to report that Price was inmate and cell are okay. And so obviously, they weren't looking after this man at all. This is Eric Hept, who is a Seattle attorney working with the Price family on a wrongful death lawsuit. I was appalled and developing disabled man, mentally ill, who couldn't afford his low bail amount, was held in solitary confinement for a year. He was not serving a sentence. He was awaiting trial the whole time for a crime he wasn't mentally capable of committing. Even if you put everything else aside, this alone is a travesty of justice. There is no excuse for an atrocity like this. And I could say these things, happen to people who, particularly men who are pretty severely mentally ill, also have a lower IQ. So, they're, even if they're doing well, it's hard to advocate for yourself when you have an IQ of 55, because a lot of the terminology and the rhetoric that's going to be used by the police department and everything may just be outside of something that you're able to access. And so, this man had, they just threw him in this jail cell and let him rot there until he starved to death and died. I mean, this is an unimaginable atrocity. And yet it has happened before. This happened in the jail run by Sheriff David Clark in Milwaukee. There was a schizophrenic man there who flooded his jail cell. And so they turned off the water until he dehydrated to death. And, this is just going to keep occurring. And if you look at the atrocities committed, particularly in and around the American criminal justice system, you pretty quickly realize that we really shouldn't be going around the world and telling other countries how they, have to treat their own people because we're so great and wonderful and, should be the ones doing that. Now, one more story I want to mention. This is from the Associated Press. It's titled, Harvard Rescinds Fellowship Offer to Leading Rights Activists. Harvard University rescinded a fellowship that it had offered to a leading human rights activist over what he said Monday was his group's criticism of Israel. Kenneth Ross, who is the executive director of Human Rights Watch, or HRW, until last year, was recruited by the Harvard Kennedy School Carr Center for Human Rights Policy to become a fellow, and he accepted. But a week later, in July, Ross said the center told him that the dean of the school, Douglas Enderdorf, had not approved it. Ross said he wasn't given a reason, but believes it was due to his group's criticism of Israel. It is unclear why it took 6 months for the decision to become public, though the Nation reported the issue last week. And so, I just wanted to, again, mention this story because I think it very symbolic of, how much control the Israel lobby has in America, where this is Harvard hiring somebody from Human Rights Watch, and Israel is able to interfere because Human Rights Watch has called Israel an apartheid state. All right. Now I want to move into some news about Ukraine. Dave DeCamp has been doing some fantastic writing at antiwar.com. First up, Ukraine defense minister says it is a fact that Kiev is a de facto NATO member. And so this is, I don't know, maybe the eighth high-ranking Ukrainian official to make this kind of statement. And in a lot of ways, I think they're absolutely right. Although, that's terrifying. And I'm not saying that means we should make them a official member of NATO, but I do think it's true that, Ukraine is essentially a de facto member. The defense minister said he was confident that Ukraine's Western backers would supply Kiev with warplanes and tanks despite some concerns about escalating the war. A day later, the British prime minister confirmed he would be sending Challenger 2 tanks. This concern about the next level of escalation for me is some kind of protocol. The defense minister said Ukraine as a country and the armed forces of Ukraine became a member of NATO de facto, not de jure by law, because we have weaponry and understanding of how to use it. Now, I want to mention one more thing about the warplanes there. I want to really focus on this, and I think we should all pay attention to this warplane issue and just be aware that I think there might be some kind of plan going on. And I think that may be why the Pentagon doesn't want to send the ground launched small diameter bombs to Ukraine. And that's because they plan on sending Ukraine warplanes. And so they could just, put JDAM kits on those small diameter bombs and not have to deal with mounting them onto rockets as well. And then having launchers in Ukraine and everything like that. The British Prime Minister confirms the UK will provide Ukraine with tanks. So this going into a little bit more what we touched on in the last article, the Prime Minister outlined the UK's ambitions to intensify our support for Ukraine, including through the provision of Challenger 2 tanks and additional artillery systems. The Prime Minister's office said in a readout of the call, the Challenger 2 could be the first Western-made heavy tank that reaches Ukraine. Poland said it's ready to send German-made Leopard 2 tanks to Kiev, but it's not clear if Warsaw has officially begun the process of sending the tanks, which would involve formally asking Berlin for permission. Britain is sent to send 14 Challenger 2s in the coming weeks, far short of the 30 tanks Ukrainian officials said they needed. Poland said it's willing to send a similar number, but it's hoping to do so as a part of an international coalition. I speculated this either on the last show or the show before, and I do think this is what's going on here, where the Poles, kind of put themselves out front here, but now they got the Brits involved. The Germans are at least going along with Poland sending the Leopard tanks. And so I think they're going to try to dump maybe like 80, 90, I don't know if they could get many more than that, tanks from all these different NATO members. And I'm guessing that the U.S. is going to make some kind of contribution, although my understanding is moving around these, full scale, the full size tanks, not the smaller ones that the U.S. and Europeans have been saying, is a bit more of a logistical challenge. It's not quite as quick and easy. And so I'm, maybe the Leopard 2 tanks will get there first. Just logistically, Poland is so close. My guess is a little bit easier to move those tanks, although who knows where the UK tanks are. They could be in Germany or Poland or something. Anyways, it's not that the UK doesn't carry out war games and have military equipment in these countries. And so I'm sure it's possible to kind of, rotate those to Ukraine and then move new tanks or tanks that are stationed somewhere else to these European countries if you still want them there. Next up, Russia launches new round of missile strikes across Ukraine. Russia on Saturday launched missile strikes across Ukraine that targeted energy infrastructure after a 2-week lull in such attacks. The strikes hit energy facilities in the capital of Kiev and regions around Ukraine. A Russian missile also hit an apartment building in the city of Dnipro, and dozens of civilians were reported killed. The Russian Defense Ministry said all designated targets were hit in the missile barrage and didn't comment on the reports of the apartment building strike. Moscow maintains it didn't target civilians, but its attacks on infrastructure have left millions of Ukrainian civilians without power. And no doubt that anytime you use these high-powered missiles, you're going to kill some people, and no matter how accurate your weapons are supposed to be, there's a lot of things that could send them off target. An advisor to Ukrainian President Zelensky suggests that the missile hit the apartment building may have fallen after it was intercepted by Ukrainian air defense. His comments were picked up by Russian media, and the advisor has faced criticism inside of Ukraine for what he said. Now, one of the reasons I want to bring this up is because people like to overstate, right? So this is said, and then the Russians will, try to make the point something along the lines of, "Oh, see, it was the Ukrainians' fault." Well, that's not the case, right? It was still the fact that the Russians fired a missile into Ukraine that caused the Ukrainians to use their outdated air defense systems, or even an effective air defense system, and shot down or slightly altered the trajectory of this rocket and caused the apartment building to get hit. At the same time, the Western media, the Ukrainians right now, are really trying to capitalize on this missile strike like they did in Bucha or other areas of Ukraine where they allege that war crimes happened. And so one of the important things is that if the Russians were targeting energy infrastructure and not an apartment building, and a Ukrainian air defense missile did hit the Russian missile and caused it to hit the apartment building, is that the Ukrainian government's fault? No, but it's the Russian government intentionally targeting individual apartment buildings in Ukraine? No, and pretending that the Russians are doing that is key to Western propaganda here. So I think it's important to debunk that a little bit. Turkey says it's unlikely to approve Sweden, Finland, NATO bids before June. And usually the Turkish president, Recep Erdogan, I think is a real villain on the world stage. He really likes to flex his muscles for his own, Turkish ethnic groups goals, essentially, and is willing to oppress his own people, particularly the Kurdish minority in Turkey, to get there. However, this particular bout of just, I guess, Erdogan being Erdogan has is working out for people who take my opinion on the world because it's preventing the expansion of NATO. So a spokesperson for Erdogan said Ankara is unlikely to approve Sweden and Finland joining NATO before June. The spokesperson said Sweden needs time before it can codify new counterterrorism measures into law, changes Ankara wants to be made before signing off on Stockholm's NATO membership. It may take 6 months to codify them until June, the spokesperson said. Turkey's main issue with Sweden and Finland is their alleged support for the Kurdish militant group PKK, which Ankara, the EU, and the US consider a terrorist organization. Turkey has been demanding Sweden extradite suspected PKK members and other people over allegations they were involved in the coup, but Sweden's Supreme Court has opposed some extraditions. I think Turkey said they're now hoping to get 130 people from Sweden. Initially, I thought that Turkey would make a little bit more of a modest ask here, and the Nordic countries would sell out the Kurds and extradite a couple people to Turkey and change some policies to get Turkey on board with their NATO membership. And possibly around this time, we would actually be looking at Turkey, saying, they're getting close to meeting our needs and things like that, and taking those steps. But Erdogan's asking for a lot, and maybe the Nordic countries actually won't do it. So we'll see that, maybe this will actually work out and prevent NATO membership. And, who knows, maybe that's one of Erdogan's goals. Turkey does, sit as the bridge between Europe and Asia. And I think, in some ways, Turkey has seen itself as the potential bridge between NATO and Russia to de-escalate the situation. And Erdogan has really pushed talks. And so maybe he's being ridiculous here with the idea that it's the only way to kill the NATO bid. If he, just came out and straight up said, I don't want these countries in NATO because it'll upset Russia and escalate tensions or something like that, then of course you're a Putin puppet, and Turkey could lose its NATO standing and a lot else. But at the same time, if they just make absurd demands, then it doesn't seem like it's for the benefit of Russia or peace or anything that the Western press actually opposes. Next up, Senator Menendez says he won't approve F-16 sale to Turkey. Senator Bob Menendez, the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has come out against a potential F-16 sale to Turkey that was reported by the Wall Street Journal on Friday. Now, there's so much hypocrisy here. Obviously, these congressmen never have any problem with selling weapons to any of these governments that have extreme problems like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or giving weapons away for free to Ukraine. And of course, if you're opposed to giving weapons to Ukraine, you're some kind of monster. But yet now they're finally having an issue with one of the weapon sales. The report said that the Biden administration is preparing to notify Congress of major arms deals for Turkey and Greece, two NATO allies that have been at odds over territorial disputes in the Aegean and Mediterranean seas for decades. My guess is that typically the U.S. probably does these agreements with the two countries together to maintain some kind of parity between the two. My guess is that's mostly to relieve anxieties in Ankara and Athens than to actually make sure they don't go to war with each other. But who really knows? It would be quite the crazy thing to see, Greek F-35s going up against Turkish F-16s, but that isn't exactly impossible. Menendez said, President Erdogan continues to undermine international law, disregard human rights, and democratic norms, and engage in enlarging and destabilizing behavior in Turkey against neighboring NATO allies. And again, there's so many worse countries and violators of all those things that he just pointed out. Next up, U.S. to boost military aid to Micronesia in exchange for more military access. And so I think this pairs really well with the story that I wrote last week about a new military base being built in Palau by the United States. And Micronesia is a country that's, located relatively close in the scale of the, very vast Pacific Ocean. And so this is about the U.S. trying to increase its great game abilities against China and have more military assets closer to China. This is obviously going to be provocative, and whenever China signs any of these agreements, the U.S. Flips out and claims that Beijing is trying to take over the world and things like that. Next up, this from Dave DeCamp from January 11th, U.S.-Japan announced steps to strengthen military cooperation against China. The U.S. and Japan, this was last Wednesday, I guess, announced steps to strengthen military cooperation to better confront China after Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Antony Blinken met their Japanese counterparts in Washington. The meeting came after the government of Japanese Prime Minister Kishida rolled out a new national security strategy that names China as a top challenge, reflecting similar language used by the Pentagon. His government also announced a plan to double military spending by 2027, and we talked about this quite a bit. Before I wrap up the show today, I think three more stories here that are pretty important. This one here is Iraqi Prime Minister supports open-ended U.S. troop presence. Iraq's new Prime Minister told the Wall Street Journal in an interview published on Sunday that he supports a continued U.S. troop presence in Iraq, breaking the silence on the issue since he came into office in October 2020. I have to imagine that this is really about American pressure. So, here's the thing. The Americans are in Syria, and they say that this is to prevent the rise of ISIS, which is just complete lie, right? If you want to stop the rise of ISIS, you would get out of Syria and you get out of Iraq, because there are governments, multiple armies, multiple militias that all want to get rid of the Islamic State. And at this point, the Americans interfere far more with the Shia militias than they do with the ISIS, and the Shia militias would be taking on ISIS. And so if we get out of the way, then, these regional problems will solve themselves without American bloodshed blood being spilt, American money being spent, and hatred for America being ginned up whenever, which always happens, we arm or fund the wrong militia that goes out and commits atrocities, or we, use a bomb with bad intelligence and we kill an entire family or something crazy like that. And so, we could get out of this situation and have ISIS defeated. But what the U.S. wants to do in Syria is to prevent Assad, Iran, and Russia from finally winning the Syrian civil war. And so they're trying to bleed the Syrian state with sanctions. And at the same time, they continue to occupy between a third and a quarter of eastern Syria. Now, the U.S. cannot stay in Syria, I really believe. And, I guess it could get challenging. They could maybe figure things out. But if they actually had to leave Iraq, it would be seriously difficult to maintain that presence in Syria, if not absolutely impossible. And so, with the idea that American troops need to be in Iraq to train against ISIS is just untrue. And it's a part of the continued American military occupation and dominance over the Middle East. And, this is just the U.S. exerting their power to get their, the people they have influence over in Iraq to do what they want. Now, last up here, Syria's Assad tells Russia any deal with Turkey must result in Turkish withdrawal. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad told a Russian envoy that any rapprochement with Turkey must result in Turkish forces withdrawing from Syrian territory. Turkish forces are in a lot of Syrian territory. The Idlib province, I think, more or less is Turkish soldiers that maintain the boundary, this ceasefire between the Syrian, the Russian, and the Al-Qaeda-backed forces in that region. So Idlib, Syria is, a little bit of an Al-Qaeda stand up there that's controlled by Turkey. The Afrin province of Syria, that's in northern Aleppo, that was a Kurdish stronghold that was taken over by Turkish forces a few years ago during Operation Olive Branch, I believe. And so, that's another region Turkey would have to withdraw from. And then there's a region between Afrin all the way, I think it's past the Euphrates River there. It's to an area where Al-Babis and Manbij are. And these are two cities in northern Syria. And all that territory is also controlled by Turkey, as well as a small portion, I think like 5 to 10 kilometers, all the way from the rest of the Syrian border along to Iraq. So this is a pretty big ask by Assad, but I think it would help to wrap up the Syrian civil war, and we'll see if everything going on, all the other political dynamics going on, maybe make Erdogan and Turkey a little bit more willing to accept a deal with Assad to finally wrap up this war. And maybe from Turkey's perspective, Assad will be more controlling of the Kurds than the Americans are. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap it up. Hope everybody's enjoying the show. I'll be back with more shows later this week. I am in the process of moving. I'm hoping I'm going to be able to get out 3 shows this week. This show is obviously coming out late, but I'm going to try to put out one probably tomorrow and then one on Friday. Anyways, thank you all so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.